and we enjoyed having both of them on here. And one of them said, hey, can you get the other guy on with me at the same time? I said, sure, let's do that. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves because you've been here before, and just take about 5 minutes up front to give a little bit of background on, who you are, what you've done with I won't even call you anti-MLM because to me, I'm not anti or pro-MLM. I'm just saying if we had retail sales and we had visibility to how much money is being made by tools, then I would be pro-MLM. But with those two things in play, I'm anti-MLM, which just makes heads explode on both sides. They can't figure me out. I'm an anti-MLMer to the pro-MLMers and the opposite to the anti-MLMers. So anyway, it's a little confusing. But anyway, let me just stop right there and let you guys, take about 5 minutes each and introduce yourselves on what your involvement with the MLM experience is. And Glenn, if you want to go first, go right ahead.
Yeah, I contacted Scott because I saw Sean's presentation on the history of the MLM Amway tool scam, and it's honestly the best anti-MLM video or MLM video that I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of them. The things that he was saying and talking about, I've been urging and almost begging the big anti-MLMers to cover, and they just haven't covered it. But my story is that in 2001, so 22 years ago, me and my father joined Amway. I was in for a short period of time because I could smell the rat almost straight away. I think I was in about 4 weeks. I think the straw that broke the camel's back was there was this extreme pressure coming from the sponsor, the upline, to attend a Amway event at Rod Laver Arena, which is the tennis center. Tickets were $235 each, which I just thought was completely over the top. The sponsor kept saying how he's busy, he was struggling with the business, it was going nowhere, and then he attended this function and it changed his life. Like he just said, it was just this relentless pressure over that. And this is what people think when they attend these functions. They'll spend $200, $300 on a ticket, and they honestly think it's going to change life. This function had 15,000 people there, and you got to understand, every single one of those 15,000 people thought, this could change my life. This is $300 that could change, $235 then, that could change their whole life, which is not possible for there to be 15,000 diamonds in the city of Melbourne, or for that, it's not possible for there to be $15,000 diamonds on the planet. So from there, my father was a taxi driver. So basically, every single person that would get into his taxi, he would prospect. Every single time he would go to a shop and buy something, he'd prospect them, or he would get their business card, wait a bit of time, and then ring them up and say, I was really impressed with you the other day when you were working at the car dealership or wherever the place was. I'm working with some really successful people. I can't promise you anything, but I think there may be an opportunity here for you to become wealthy like these millionaires that he's working with. You just think about the raw numbers. In his taxi, we're talking 15 to 25 people a day over a 12-hour period getting into his taxi, and he prospected every single one of them. So we're talking tens of thousands of people. He did that for about 15 years, and then the last sort of 5 to 6 years, he had to stop taxi driving because he just physically wasn't able to do it, but he now spends his days going from shop to shop, prospecting the shopkeepers. He'll just go out, put a suit on, get on a train, and just prospect. And to this day, he hasn't helped anybody become rich. Not one person that he's prospected or shown the plan to, or even the people that have joined, has become rich. I mean, I thought it was amazing too. He actually recruited his taxi boss, the owner. This is a man that owned 38 taxi licenses. So a taxi license back then was worth about $600,000. So this man had 38 times $600,000 cab licenses. And even he thought Dad was convincing enough to tell a guy that had 38 times $600,000 in licenses that Amway could make him further rich. So it's not just sort of desperate people that fall for this. It's really successful, shrewd business people as well. That's how effective some of this propaganda can be. That always surprises people when I told them that he recruited his taxi boss. Of course, the boss wasn't in for long because he could smell it straight away that something's up with this. But anybody who had PS had contact with, he's prospected, shown plans to, but it's all come to nothing. So, and I think too that the problem was that almost the best job possible for an IBO would be to be a taxi driver because you can prospect every single person that gets into your taxi.
Yeah, that's quite incredible. And I just wanted to point out too, Glenn, that it's not just the tickets you're paying for, but often you have to travel across the country. And so you've got transportation costs, you've got hotels, you've got meals, so for someone that says, well, it's only a couple $100, well, yeah, that's just a ticket though. That's the tip of the iceberg as far as, the money that you're paying out. And so not all the money that you're paying out is going to the upline, but it is going out of your pocket, and it is part of your overhead, your losses, until you can make more than that from Amway and make a net profit. So it's a big money loss. It's huge. I guess, Sean, would you like to take a few minutes just to, give us your background and your involvement with MLM?
Sure. My name is Sean Munger, and I am a historian. I have a PhD in American history. I don't have a personal past involvement with multi-level marketing, at least not beyond. I had a family member who was briefly involved in Amway in the 90s. He did not, unlike Glenn's father, he did not get as deeply involved and was kind of out before too long. But I did notice some very odd things that had occurred during the time that he was in, particularly the hoarding of these strange cassette tapes and books with bizarre titles and that sort of thing. But beyond that, I didn't really have much of an involvement with multi-level marketing. I obviously knew what Amway was from that experience and from just kind of generally it sort of being out there in the culture. But I do a lot of, I am not affiliated with the university. I'm what they call alt-ac or alternative academia. So I'm kind of a freelancer and kind of a generalist, and I teach classes on sort of a contract basis for various clients, both public and private. I have some middle school classes, and I offer classes on my website, that sort of thing. And I also do a lot of video projects, like kind of video essays, really historical essays on my YouTube channel. And they're historical projects that I will work on intensively for a while, and then I don't exclusively focus on one area or one subject. But I did become very interested in the history of Amway, and particularly the tools business. I don't know why I agree with what's been said previously that a lot of people in the anti-MLM space have missed the significance of the tools business, or what I call the tools cult, because I believe it is a cult. So I don't know what gave me a clarity that I saw something there that maybe others have missed. But I had read one of the texts, one of the books that was written in the 80s by ex-Amway distributors who were exposing what was going on. And those of you in the anti-MLM space are probably familiar with them. Probably the most prominent one now is Eric Scheibler, but the one I originally read was Stephen Butterfield, which was written in the early 80s. In my video, I call these the apostate texts, and was very fascinated by they talk a lot about the structure of Amway, but they also talked about the business with the tools, which includes the cassette tapes and the system someone mentioned earlier as what it's called, the rallies and that sort of thing. And kind of, I've always had an interest in what I call organized deception, which I classify basically as scams, cults, and conspiracy theories. I've always been fascinated by why do people believe them? How do they get started? How do they get perpetuated? And the stories of sort of great scams in history are really fascinating. For example, a couple of years ago, I did a series of videos on there's an island up in Canada called Oak Island where people have been looking for supposedly buried treasure there for over 150 years. There isn't any treasure there, and it's the result of a scam that was developed in the 1850s that's still ensnaring people today, even more than a century later. So I did some videos on that. So I'm very interested in, how did these things start, and who created? Somebody came up with this idea of selling tapes, motivational tapes, within the MLM structure. Whose idea was that, and under what circumstances did they come up with that idea? And the more that I started to look into this, the deeper the connections, the historical connections I found between the people who were establishing the Amway tools business and various other aspects of society, particularly politics and religion, because many of the tools kingpins were evangelical Christians who then got connected into the Republican Party during the Ronald Reagan era. And like, for example, Dexter Yeager, who I'm sure we're going to talk about, his best friend was Jim Baker, the televangelist who was brought down by scandals in the late 1980s. There's all these connections that sort of weave their way through American business and political history over the last 60 years or so. And no one has told this story. So I was just very fascinated that whenever I went to look for historical sources, and again, I'm a historian, so I come at this from the standpoint of what are the sources, what have people said about this in the past, what can we document? And there's very few sources on this topic. And I realized this was a big story that people haven't really told from this angle. So I did a bunch of research, and I put it together. Other historians probably would have written an article or even a book or whatever, but I chose to do a video on my YouTube channel, and it's called The History of the Amway Tools Scam. It's about 2 hours long. And it's everything that I tried to put in there, that I was able to do research on this amazing story of how the tools business began in the 1960s. And then the story continues up until really the early 1980s, because what happened was the Amway, there's really two businesses here. There's the Amway Corporation, which manufactures soap and some other things. That's the multi-marketing organization. And then there's the tools business, which is separate. It's under separate ownership, separate leadership, and it inures to the benefit of a completely different group of people. And the relationship between businesses are really unusual in business history. So I started to document what is that relationship. And it turned out that there was a battle in the early 80s where Amway Corporation tried to get a piece of the tools business, which is where most of the money was being made in Amway. And as Glenn said, even the most dedicated people who are out there prospecting the multi-level marketing business are not finding very much success at all. And the Amway Corporation, of course, realized this in the early 80s. They tried to do something about it. They tried to either stop it or control it or get a piece of it. And there was an extraordinary showdown at a hotel in Miami in the early 80s, and I document this in my video. There is a tape recording of that meeting, which is absolutely an astonishing source. I think the most interesting and illuminating source in the whole history of MLMs. And I quote liberally, and in my video, of course, I present snippets from that tape, which is just an incredible story. So I put the video up and then started to have a lot of feedback, including from Scott and others who have said some things like Glenn said earlier, just before we started the show, that they thought I had gotten something right that was not being told in other venues. So that's pretty much where I am. I don't really consider myself part of the anti-MLM movement. I don't really identify as that. This is just a historical source or a historical story that I thought needed to be told, and no one else was telling it. So I kind of took it upon myself to do that. So that's how I got into this whole thing.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And I'll let you guys just go ahead and have a conversation. Glenn, I know you had some questions and some types of, or topics of discussion to go over with Sean. So, go right ahead and dig into it.
Yeah, I think the big thing that Sean got that a lot of people don't get is the political aspect of this. The Amway Corporation, it's for decades has been one of the biggest political donators there is, especially in the USA, more so than places like Australia. Having said that, they still donate a lot of money to all sides of politics here. But this is something that, Sean's talking about, but the professional anti-MLMs are not, which I find really fascinating. And I think to us, a bit of a myth that it's just the one side of politics. I think in the early days it was just the one side of politics, but now it's across the board. Kamala Harris, for example, her husband is a lawyer who defends MLM companies. Bill Clinton made an absolute fortune doing Amway speeches. So it's definitely not a right or a left side of politics thing anymore, even though it used to be. And I think this is something that, sadly, most people are missing. But Sean seemed to understand that in his presentation.
Yeah, and you're exactly right that it since basically if you look at my video, I will mention in kind of the middle of the story in the 1970s there was the FTC decision about Amway, and I talk about that in my video, and that's been mentioned a lot in whenever the subject of history of MLMs comes up. Sort of my story sort of cuts off only a couple of years after that. And then what happened basically after the story that I told in my video was that the kingpins, the tools kingpins who had a lot of political power, particularly Dexter Yeager, who was very well connected to Jim Baker and the PTL ministry and the evangelical Christian movement and the religious right, those kinds of organizations. But beginning in the 80s, particularly, and then this ramped up greatly in the 90s, they did start to basically buy political protection. And they recognized eventually that, and probably early on, that, they were certainly helped by Ronald Reagan and his administration when he came into power in the 80s, and then George Bush, the first George Bush, one of whose advisors was Doug Weed, a Republican Party operative, whom I talk at great length about in my video. But even after the Bush, the first era, they started making a lot of political contributions to Democrats as well. And Bill Clinton is a great example because he was kind of an early target, I think, in the 90s, where they're like, well, we're not always going to be able to count on an FTC that's controlled by Republican administrations. Democrats are going to get back in office at some point. It behooves us, assuming this conversation went on somewhere, it behooves us to try to curry favor with them as well. And it worked. So you're right that Clinton has spoken at Amway events, and I didn't know about Kamala Harris's husband, but that doesn't surprise me a bit. So this did become kind of a bipartisan project where now government, and particularly the federal government, is deeply in the business of protecting the multi-level marketing industry.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
Can I interrupt for a second? Only because
sure.
Both of you have stated it. I want to underline it for those people that are listening in. You basically say it's almost pay to play with politicians. If you pay, you won't be in trouble. Amway pays a lot. Herbalife pays a lot. They hired every friggin' MLM attorney they possibly can. So this way, no one could be against them because they're all on the books. So the reality is that's what smart, quote-unquote, MLM companies do. There's something that a lot of people don't know that I'll just kind of throw out here, and you could check this out because you're the historian who likes to check for things. There's a very well-known person named Glenn Turner who ran Dare to Be Great, who was eventually put in prison, and he happened to live in Florida. I happened to meet the gentleman and his wife, and rumor has it, or maybe even sometimes from his own mouth, that he got in trouble in prison and went to prison because he refused to donate to Richard Nixon. So the Nixon campaign came a-knocking. He was making a lot of money. He refused to donate Therefore, he was not willing to pay to play, and as a result of that, they went after him, prosecuted him, put the man in jail, and smeared his reputation. Now, whether Dare to Be Great was a valid MLM company, it was new when these things were going on. It was a self-development program. Arguably, some people might even say it was one of the first self-development, quote-unquote, MLMers that kind of went off the rails, took a lot of money from a lot of people. Let's leave that part aside. We're talking about politics here, and Glenn Turner was put in jail because he wouldn't play the political game that you guys have both identified. And I got to throw Robert Fitzpatrick under the bus positively here. Robert Fitzpatrick also throws up his hands in frustration that MLM has basically been politicized. And the reason why they're not being gone after is because they are so heavily, if you will, lining the pockets of politicians, which is a really great way to be able to kind of grease those palms like they did with Kamala Harris and her husband, as a result of them being able to, quote-unquote, stay out of jail. Betsy DeVos, the Amway daughter-in-law, if you will, becoming, what was she, Department of Education? Seriously? Seriously? Like, that's Pete Buttigieg becoming Department of Transportation, or maybe we'll throw the Republican under, what was his name? Carson. Ben Carson. Becoming Department of whatever the hell he was.
Or James Watt becoming Secretary of the Interior.
Yeah, I mean they're all bought and paid for. I mean the bottom line is they're all bought and paid for. So if you play the political game like Herbalife does and like Amway does, then you're going to be able to get away with it. And if you don't, like Glenn Turner did not, you're going to jail. So that I'll let that hang. Let you comment on it. And it might be something as someone like you who is a historian give you one more little thing to go chase after.
Yeah, and Sean, before you get started, I'd like to just tack on to what Peter just said from the FTC perspective. The Herbalife had a former FTC commissioner on their staff when the FTC sued Herbalife. And I don't remember her name, but anyway, she knew all of the tricks of the trade, right? She knew all the processes. She knew people because she was a former FTC commissioner. And then sometime before the end of, before the settlement occurred in 2016, they also brought in a former FTC chairperson to be on their staff defending them against the FTC. So that revolving door between Washington and private practice, particularly lawyers, is really devious. I mean, it's really, to me, it should be illegal, but it happens all the time. And it's not just with the, FTC, it's with a lot of other departments, defense, whatever. It happens all the time. People come into government, they learn the tricks of the trade, they go to private practice somewhere and make the big bucks, and they might even come back again. I mean, it's incredible how it goes around like that. And also, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. I actually have a cassette tape somewhere. I have a lot of cassette tapes. I won't go into that story, but I have a lot of cassette tapes, and I have one of them. That is Ronald Reagan in 1975 speaking at an Amway convention. I think he was governor at that time. He may have been out of office, I'm not sure, but 1975, Ronald Reagan in front of an Amway crowd. And I also personally saw George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, live in Atlanta, Georgia, at, I believe, still the largest business convention ever. It was in the old Georgia Dome, and there was something like 80,000 people there, and it was George H.W. Bush's first public appearance since he had lost the election, and he was in front of this huge Amway crowd that was, put on by Dexter Yeager and so forth. But anyway, that's just a couple of little tidbits as far as, how real this stuff is. To me, it really is real. It's not just people talking. So I'll hand it back to Sean, and then you guys can continue. Go right ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that's all correct. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the reason why these people could pay to play is because of the immense earning potential of the tools business, the tools cult. Because Amway itself only became a very large corporation, a very large business with a lot of sales, because they had the captive audience of the distributors who were in thrall to the tools cult, basically. This is, in fact, identified specifically on the Miami Showdown tape. There's a portion where one of the diamond, the kingpins, or they're often called the diamonds, or I will often call them the kingpins, but he says specifically that the whole reason why Amway became a big corporation was because of the tools business, was because they were selling, the kingpins were selling tapes and rallies and seminars and those kinds of things to their distributors. So this was what enabled them to amass the vast amount of funds that they needed to be able to buy politicians.
Yeah, without the tools business, people like Dexter Yeager wouldn't have 20 cars and lots of homes and lots of bling. So there would be nothing for the rank and file distributor to look up to and try and emulate. If you take away the tools business. But as for George Bush, he actually spoke at the founder's funeral, DeVos. That's how close Bush and DeVos were, that he actually spoke at his funeral. And I mean, if you're trying to tell somebody that Amway is a scam, and it's a pretty good comeback to say, well, if it was a scam, would the President of the United States speak at the founder's funeral? That's the sort of...
that was the junior Bush too, right? That was George W. Bush. So yeah, both Bushes were in the tank, so to speak, with Amway.
Yeah, and the conduit to specifically the Bush family from Amway was Doug Weed. I mean, he was the guy that brought them together, because he had been employed in the beginning in the 70s by Dexter Yeager as a publicist, as a ghostwriter, and various other functions. And then he eventually got in with the Republican establishment, like he was tangentially connected to the Reagan campaign in 1980, but he eventually sort of found a home on the staff of Bush, who was then the first Bush, who was then vice president. And so he was the conduit by which Amway was able to sort of co-opt politics, at least at that time. And that's why I think he's an enormously important person in this story, which is why I talk about him a lot in my video.
Yeah, in fact, Doug Weed was a diamond in Amway. He was, I think, under Dexter Yeager's tutelage. But Sean, you mentioned when you were on the show before how Doug Weed may have been the guy who actually brought the tool scam idea to Dexter Yeager and Bill Britt. If you could just talk about that a little bit. I think that's a fascinating part of what you brought to the table here.
Sure. The key portion for me in my historical research was figuring out, how did the tools business start? And there are very, very few sources written on this. And the reason is because the tools business functions very much like the mafia, where there tend to be family businesses. There's a cone of silence over it. No one ever talks. No one ever leaves. And it's not like there's any kind of free-flowing sort of revolving door of leadership or benefit in these structures. They're very tightly controlled. So people who know what happened at the higher echelons of this particular business, very few of them have ever talked about it. As a result, there's no sources about this. And as a historian, you live and die on sources. What can you actually prove? So the only source and I talk about this in my video, that I wish we didn't have to rely on the one source I was able to find. And the one source I was able to find was Doug Weed, who wrote about the origin of the tools business on his blog in the 2000s. He's dead now, but his blog is still up. And he talked about how there was a meeting in Miami, and we know that Dexter Yeager was there and Bill Britt was there. And then he also says that another man who he refused to identify publicly was also there. And this unidentified person floated the idea that, hey, if you invest in a tape duplicating machine, and this is in the early 1970s, if you invest in a tape duplicating machine and start marketing motivational tapes to your downline, you can make a lot of money. And the way the story goes, Yeager said, no, I don't want to do that. But Bill Britt, who founded his own large Amway organization, said, yes, I'll do it. And he poured in the equivalent of about more than $300,000 today in a tape duplicating operation. And so that's kind of how the tools business started. So it's unfortunate. I don't trust Doug Weed on a lot of things because I don't think that he was very accurate in a lot. I mean, I think the facts of what he reports are probably right, but he had so much spin on everything that he said. I read his blog extensively and found very little of it that was particularly reliable in the sense of how he portrayed the history of multi-level marketing. But yet I do believe there's some hallmarks of this story if you match up Bill Britt's, what little we know about him and certainly what we know about Dexter Yeager's past. It does kind of fit. So I wish that there was some other independent documentary evidence of how the tools business started. But in the absence of anything else I was able to find, we kind of have to run with that origin story. So I think it probably did start that way. And I would like to know so much more about it, particularly who that unidentified person was. It might have been Weed himself. I'm not sure because it seemed to have happened earlier than Weed first met Dexter Yeager, which was in the late 70s. But we don't know who that person was. And obviously that person is very important in the history of multi-level marketing. So it would be nice to identify them.
I want to jump back in here. Whoops. Let me jump in real quick relative to the technology. We had spoken about this, I think, Sean, when you were here once before, that in the self-development field, which was kind of started by Vic Conant and Earl Nightingale, Earl Nightingale came out with the vinyl record called The Strangest Secret, and he sold like 1 million copies, and that's really what started kind of like the self-development thing. But then when audio tapes became available, tape duplication machines became available. And I think we kind of identified, on the phone when we were talking, that might have been the origin of the tape portion, the audio cassette portion of the tools scam, because finally someone could buy a duplicating device that was probably used in churches and self-development stuff and all those types of things, and then be able to mass produce them on their own. Whereas like a Dexter Yeager would have to buy a vinyl record manufacturing facility if they were going to do it with vinyl records. So the technology and the concept of the tool scam kind of hit right around that same time with audio cassettes. And I think, if I recall, you had the recording of the guy that was trying to sell audio duplicating equipment to Dexter Yeager for, I don't remember the price. I think you said something like $50,000 or something like that.
Yeah, I think it was $50,000. So could
you refresh our memory to that story if you don't mind?
Well, it's the same story that I'm talking about.
Okay, got it.
That it was Doug Weed who had the account on his blog, which was written in the late 2000s, decade of the first decade of the century, where he reminisced about this meeting that had occurred, and I placed it probably in 1970 or 1971, which matches up precisely with how the technology was progressing at that particular point in time. So it was very serendipitous that they were able to come up with this idea right as the technology was there to make it a reality and before anyone else had really gotten to it. So you're absolutely right about, and especially about the Earl Nightingale record, which was Yeager's first exposure to this kind of thing. And then clearly Britt was the guy who started really duplicating the tapes, and he gave Yeager a sweetheart deal on duplication. And so then they started kind of pumping these materials out through their downlines. If we zoom out a bit, one of the things that I think is so interesting about this is because it is that, I mean, Yeager worked the Amway business very intensively. He joined in 1964. And his story is not dissimilar to the one that Glenn just told about his father, about how, you know, sort of slavishly he worked at this, prospecting everybody, and he wasn't making any money at it. And by the end of the 60s, these guys who were fairly high-level Amway distributors, I mean, Dexter Yeager, I think, went diamond in 1969, if I recall that correctly. But they realized that there really wasn't, you couldn't make a whole lot of money in Amway. And so what they essentially did was they invented a new income stream that replaced the income that they should have been making or thought they would be making from selling Amway distributorships. And ever since, there's been this sort of cloak and dagger appearance that the Kingpin very circumspect about hinting or allowing the outside world to assume that their lavish lifestyles, the 20 Rolls Royces and those type of things, because they were so successful in selling Amway, where in reality they got the 20 Rolls Royces because they got so rich selling tapes to Amway distributors. And even Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes fell for this deception. And I talk about this in my video too, where in 1982, or I guess it was early 1983, Mike Wallace interviewed Dexter and Bertie Yeager at their mansion in Charlotte, North Carolina, which was a pilgrimage site for Amway distributors, by the way. And he never pressed the question, where does all this come, where does your income come from? Is it really selling? Yeah. Is it really selling soap or selling Amway distributorships, or is it from the tapes and books and rallies? And that's always, the Kingpins have always tried to hide the ball on that particular point. For decades, they've been trying to do that. So I think that's very interesting that go ahead.
Yeah, so it's not overly hard to figure out, though. So the function that I was talking about in 2001, the tickets were $235, and there was 15,000 people there. I mean, you just think about how many Amway products you'd need to sell to get the equivalent of 15,000 times $235. I mean, it's so obvious it's not even funny. And I think it's almost with the political stuff. If there was a movie on TV or a series on TV where you had a business like this and the company was paying off all the politicians and the politicians would even speak at the founder's funeral, you would say, well, that's too far-fetched. That's too over the top. Mm-hmm. That couldn't possibly happen. And it's similar to what the Nazi propaganda minister said, that people believe the big lie because it's too hard for people to get their minds around all the politicians taking money off the Amway Corporation and letting them get away with it because of the donations. So the little lies you get caught on, but when the lie becomes that big, it's just people can't comprehend that this could actually happen, that the Amway Corporation's paid to every single political party, and as a result, that's why it's been allowed just to continue on for decades.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Very good point. Yeah, it's
why most people
can't. It really is just amazing. Just to kind of, go ahead.
No, I'm saying the interesting thing is we're watching it as it just happened with FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried and the political contributions and the way it played in. I don't remember how many it was, but there was like 196 different people that took political donations from FTX. Political donations. He was the second largest donator to the Democratic Party in this last election. So these politicians are all bought and sold. And, we'll see how that plays out. But back to Glenn's comment, this stuff's happening even still today. Maybe not just because of Amway, although Amway is still contributing, I'm sure, but it's happening all over the place. Politicians are for sale. And if you can pay to play, you can stay out of quote-unquote jail. Herbalife's been doing it for a real long time. Amway's doing it. Now, Vima couldn't. So when Vima couldn't, they went after him, and there's a little bit of a Christian overtone, too, whereas they don't like Christians. meaning the government goes after people that are Christian. And I won't say what I'm going to say next, but I won't say it. The reality is that because VEMA didn't have that political power and persuasion or savviness, they were actually threatened and almost shut down. But we still hear about Herbalife and Amway still today. So back to you guys.
I mean, the thing that I find bizarre too is the fact that so few people know Dexter Yeager's name. CC Suarez, I was in one of her lives and I mentioned Dexter Yeager and she's like, who the hell is Dexter Yeager? This is a person with like 95,000 subscribers who her job is MLM debunking. That's all she does. She makes videos about MLMs and she doesn't know who Dexter Yeager is. I think that there's a reason for it though. Amway's been very clever in not allowing their distributors to get onto social media and YouTube. So the big anti-MLM debunkers, they get all their information off YouTube and social media, and Amway's just not there. So that's why they haven't heard of Dexter Yeager, because Amway distributors aren't allowed to get on there and spruik their own businesses. So I think Amway's been very, very clever in keeping their distributors off YouTube, off social media, and as a result, Amway is literally getting away scot-free from these big anti-MLM debunkers. I think Amway's scared of the anti-MLM community. That's why they've made these rules to keep people away from social media. I think it's been very effective.
I think you're right. I was amazed when I started my research that Dexter Yeager does not even have a Wikipedia page.
That's bizarre, isn't it? Absolutely bizarre.
It is bizarre. This is one of the most important people in American business and political history in the last 60 years. I mean, his reach is incredible because his best friend was Jim Baker. His son currently sits on the board of Liberty University. He had connections with Jerry Falwell, both junior and senior. He had connections with all kinds of the Osteen family, all kinds of people that are very much more famous in sort of the popular understanding than he is. I think one of the reasons why, and I think you're right, Glenn, that that Amway has a tighter control over whether their people venture onto YouTube or social media, but I think that kind of shows why it sort of shows that they're able to control their people tighter than many of the other MLMs can do, and I think that's a function of the tools cult because they are so indoctrinated so frequently by the stuff that's very carefully curated, the material that's carefully curated. And I draw a parallel with, the idea of we're going to keep our people off the internet and make sure that they don't discover negative information about the company. Like that idea was possible, like that's a very late 1990s, early 2000s idea. It's like when the internet was still small, you could do that and still have some measure of success. And I draw a parallel between that and Scientology tried the same tactic at that same time, 1990s, 2000s. And this was in the days of AOL, where they would send you, the free sign up for AOL DVD or CD-ROM or whatever. And so Scientology would send a CD-ROM to their parishioners, their people, and say, here, load this program on your computer, and it's a scrubber that will limit anyone who goes on that computer, will limit their access to any website that speaks ill of Scientology. And they have, again, that tight control over their people that were able to do that. And Amway is really, I think, the only MLM that's able to do that in the social media era, because you don't see a lot. I mean, I see a lot of posts on social media generally about various MLMs that have come and gone over the last couple of years, of Beachbody and all these others that are coming and going, and you very rarely see people hawking an Amway on social media. And I think it's because
Sean, if I could add to that, because you're right. Now, I was in Amway before the internet. We started in January of 1993, and so it was a very strong sort of cultural thing. And let me just say that Amway is probably more sophisticated than most other MLMs because they've been around for a very long time. So they really plan things out and think things out. but there's a very strong demand, if you will, from the upline to follow the pattern, to follow exactly the techniques that your upline teaches you, and don't go outside of that. Now, there are also formal rules in the Amway rules that prohibit advertising online. And so, both from an upline standpoint and the corporate standpoint, those things are prohibited, but it's really part of the culture, even going back way before the internet. The only way that you could advertise even before the internet was with Amway's permission. If you wanted to put something in the yellow pages or some kind of a want ad or anything like that, back in the day with newspapers, you had to go through Amway. You had to get their permission. They wanted to look at the wording and how you position it and all of that. So there's a very long history of that type of control going back even before the internet. So I think it was easier for Amway to continue to enforce those kinds of things when the internet came along. But you guys are exactly right. There is a very strong prohibition against being on social media, which, not only hides the information about, Amway from prospects online, but it also protects the distributors from being on. In fact, you're discouraged from being online, but it also protects them from looking for information about what other people are saying about Amway in a negative connotation. So it's kind of a, two-way, both directions, separating information and people. It really is, what I would call an evil genius type of an approach. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of throw that in from more of a, let's say, historical standpoint, since we have Sean here. But Glenn, did you have another topic you wanted to cover with Glenn? I'm sorry, with Sean?
Yeah, I think what Amway is very good at is getting the crazy promises said behind closed doors and not filmed. So when you go to the first Amway meeting that you go to, they don't say the crazy stuff. There's not the huge promises made. It's once you're established and you're in, that's when they start making the crazy promises. And they go to a lot of effort to make sure that that's not filmed and that's not caught, and that can't get onto YouTube. So they're very, very, very there's a massive effort to keep the promises off YouTube, because they know that if it gets onto YouTube, you're going to have the big YouTubers with, some of them have hundreds of thousands of subscribers, going through it piece by piece by piece and breaking it down and just completely debunking it. And that's why if you type in anti-MLM on YouTube, it's bizarre, but there's almost nothing on Amway at all, even though it's the biggest one. They've done an amazing job. Just think about how amazing it is. You got the biggest MLM company, and the MLM debunkers aren't talking about the biggest company. They're talking about the smaller companies. I would say it's a remarkable achievement what Amway's done. But
that's why everyone needs to go look at Sean's YouTube video, because it's great. There's actually two videos. There's the main one, and there's another smaller one where he talks some about some of the topics he did not cover and why he did not cover them in the main video. But if you want to see two really, what I consider really good videos, actually one of them is an audio on my YouTube channel, which again is linked through my Facebook page that I gave earlier.
Actually, I'm going to upload that.
One is an audio by Rich DeVos. Okay, he's one of the two co-founders, and he basically made a speech in 1983. And I'm going to use my words, not his. We know that you guys are scamming people with tools. Knock it off, or else we're going to take strong action. Well, bottom line, nothing happened. The other is a video of a fellow by the name of Andy Andrews, who a few months, maybe a couple, 3 months before he was terminated, was at a major function, and he said, we make several times more from tools than we do from Amway. And this is in front of all the distributors at a major function, a major convention type thing. And he was trying to create a system along with another 15 or 18 diamonds and above that, kind of felt bad about the tool scam. And what they decided to do was have a compensation plan for tools that was similar to Amway. In other words, with the tools, the way it is traditionally, and it is now, only the top 1% or so make a profit. Now, everybody pays into it, but only the top 1% make the profit from it. That's why it's so lucrative. But what Andy Andrews and his gang were trying to do was to pay out all the way down the line to the person that sponsored or recruited the new guy. And they were trying to, have a tool pack, if you will, a package of tools where it would have a number of cassette tapes or CDs and books and that kind of thing, like $200 or $300 worth. And then they would pay out in a MLM manner all the way up and down, the chain. And Amway originally bought into that. In fact, I didn't understand the significance when I received this, so I no longer have this. But I had a packaging that was actually manufactured by Amway in Ada, Michigan, where they're based, for Andy Andrews and his group. And that was shortly before the whole gang got terminated. And I think the reason they got terminated was people like Dexter Yeager and Bill Britt said, "Hey, Amway, if you go down that road, we're out of here." And, even that group of 15 to 18 diamonds was minuscule compared to Dexter Yeager and Bill Britt and their political influence within Amway for Amway to, do what they tell them to do, or else their business is going to really suffer. So I just wanted to kind of add that little tidbit in there. And Glenn, did you have something more? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think Amway really underestimated the potential of the tools business, which Dexter Yeager could see they couldn't. And I think it just got out of control really, really quickly. So, Amway wanted to stop it, but by the time they realized the potential, it was too far gone. And I think the other MLM companies have learned from the Amway mistake, and that's why we don't have the same sort of out-of-control tool scams in a lot of the other MLM companies, which is, again, a problem because it means that the anti-MLMers who are all from other MLM companies don't talk about Amway. And I think, too, Amway was very good at stopping people from talking about it. There was a movie called Welcome to Life, which they actually had banned in Poland.
Yes.
And today, nobody knows about that. I was on, the MLM conference that's coming up. I was on that last year, and Robert Fitzpatrick was in there, and I said, "Welcome to Life," and he said, "What's Welcome to Life?" This is the biggest guru about MLMs, and he doesn't know what Welcome to Life was, a movie that was banned. I find that extraordinary that, you've got sort of the guy who's meant to know the most about MLMs doesn't know about Welcome to Life.
Well, he's a self-proclaimed guru. Let's clarify that. He's not a guru. He's self-proclaimed. And I'm actually reading his latest book. I bought his latest book. Now, I bought it used because I'm not going to put a penny in Robert Fitzpatrick's pocket. But it's called Ponzi-nomics, The Untold Story of Multi-Level Marketing. And I've only started it. I only received the book yesterday in the mail. But I doubt he's going to focus much on the tool scam. I doubt he's going to mention the Poland situation, where I think it was mainly Network 21, which is one of the big tool scam companies, is the one that really pushed back on that film, and they got it suppressed. The Polish government kept that film from being seen for, I think it was 15 or 20 years. Now it's out there now. You can find it on YouTube. If you do a search on YouTube, Welcome to Life, Amway, or something.
I've uploaded it onto two different channels. One in full, and another one's broken up into parts.
Yeah. I've seen
Glenn,
it.
Glenn, what are your channel names?
One's Ban Live Export, and one is MLM is Fraud.
Okay, good. So people can hear that and go to those channels and see that film. Now, what's amazing to me is that film is really mostly training film that Network 21 produced themselves, and it's just sort of cobbled together, and it's really their words. And so how can you sue somebody for using their own film and their own words? It's quite remarkable. But remember, this was back in the day. It was soon after the Soviet Union fell apart and the whole Iron Curtain came crashing down, and Poland was, finally not, part of the Soviet Empire, as it were. And they were still trying to figure things out, right? They had been communists for, shortly after World War II until, I guess this was probably the late 80s. And so they really probably didn't even have much of a judicial system to sort of, sort these things out.
The movie was banned
elsewhere.
The movie wasn't just banned in Poland, it was banned worldwide. And I think it highlights just how effective Amway was at stopping anyone who was to say anything negative about Amway. I've got no doubt there would have been other filmmakers and other journalists who would have been scared off by that. The fact that Amway is so powerful, if I say something negative about them, they're going to come after me, they're going to sue me, and they're going to have my movie banned. But we're now at a time when there's so many anti-MLMers, they can't do that anymore. So it's so disappointing for me that the big anti-MLMers are not talking about Welcome to Life. I mean, the Antibot did a presentation on it, which was really good. But the other ones, I've contacted them all, and they just won't touch it for some reason. I find it really strange that they won't talk about Welcome to Life. I'll give you an example. It's different, but it's similar. The biggest adult movie of all time was called Deep Throat, and the reason why it became the biggest movie of all time was not because it was the best, but because they banned it. This is a movie that was banned in the USA, and because it was banned, people hate censorship. This made people absolutely desperate to watch it, and then eventually it was unbanned, and as a result, it to this day is the biggest adult film of all time. Not because, and again, it's only because people hate censorship. I feel like people in the anti-MLM community need to make Welcome to Life the equivalent of that movie, because people find it interesting to watch a movie that was banned. And I think, as a person that hates censorship, if you ban something, I'm going to go out of my way to watch it. And
we saw that with Prohibition. Right? That was outlawed, and that was the rise of the mafia.
So you agree with me when I say that the anti-MLM community should push Welcome to Life and say, the Amway Corporation doesn't want you to watch this, so watch it. That should be what we're pushing, but instead no one knows about it. Even Robert Fitzpatrick, bizarrely, didn't know about it.
I was very when I started doing my video and I was in the writing process and recording it, I admit I was a little bit afraid at the beginning that there might be some pushback that, Amway might try to come after me or whatever. And they've largely, I've kind of been ignored by most. I said I've started to get some comments from some pro Amway people, but they're a very tiny minority of what I've found. But when I was doing the video, I did some searches on YouTube for anything about Dexter Yager, and there's really not very much. And what I found tended to be videos uploaded by pro Dexter Yager people. So they were like, best clips of Dexter Yager's speeches or whatever, and it'd be like a 6-minute pastiche of his, kind of pontificating on his various things, and the comments were full of, wow, Dexter Yager changed my life, and wow, he's so inspirational, and this kind of thing. And I thought that there weren't a lot of people doing this kind of thing, but I thought that I was going to get a lot of pushback from those types of people saying, oh, Dexter Yager was such a wonderful, he was an American hero, how dare you tear him down, that kind of thing. And I really haven't gotten that. And I was surprised that I didn't get that reaction. Maybe it's coming just because my video still doesn't, it's not been hugely watched. It's increasing in reach, but so who knows what's going to happen in the future. But there is kind of a curious blind spot on YouTube about this kind of material. I know that the Recovering Hunbot, who has a YouTube channel, she did a profile of Dexter Yager, actually not long before my own video came out.
Actually, sorry.
She got everything right.
Sorry.
Good.
I'm actually the one. I've literally messaged every single anti-MLMer, literally begging them, please talk about Dexter Yager, please talk about Welcome to Life. Before that, she didn't know about Dexter Yager either. It's just bizarre. Like,
that's interesting.
I sent that many emails, literally begging people, please talk about Dexter Yager, and one or two have done it, but the rest, they don't know who he is. It just shows how good a job Amway is of doing everything undercover. And I think what they do is, when Amway go to a new market, they advertise really heavily, Certainly in Australia, when they arrive, they used to advertise here really, really heavily. And then they almost go underground, because what happens is they arrive in a new market, they publicize the company, but then after a few years it gets a bad reputation. They then decide to go completely the other way and go underground. Mm-hmm. But I think it just shows how effective they've been at going underground, that people don't know. The person that's made more money from MLMs than any other person in history, and people that do this stuff for a living, they make videos on anti-MLM for a living, don't know who the number is. It would be like being a basketball commentator and not knowing who Michael Jordan is.
Yeah.
And Sean, I think most of those pro Amway, pro Dexter Yeager videos are a few years old. And since the typical Amway distributor lasts a year or less, I think what you're looking at is a video that was made by a now former Amway distributor. And since the whole culture is don't go online, there's very few current Amway distributors even looking at YouTube, because they're told not to. They're told there's a bunch of garbage out there and don't pay any attention to it. You know, we have your best interest at heart, which is absolutely a big lie, and all that kind of thing. And so there are some people, like, you know, we were talking about earlier, that, you know, they see that as an enticement to go do that thing rather than don't do it. But I think most distributors do follow directions, and they just, you know, don't spend a lot of time on YouTube or any other social media. So that's, you know, my explanation of you know, why that is occurring the way it is. But I'll let you make any other comments on that.
The big thing is that they're all taught, don't let anybody steal your dream. I mean, I remember talking to my dad about this, and he'd get really angry at me. He's like, you're trying to steal my dream. His view was that I was jealous of him because I wasn't courageous enough to build the Amway business. Therefore, I was jealous of him, and I was trying to tear him down. And that's the mentality that everybody in Amway has, is that everybody else is jealous of them because they don't have the courage to do Amway, and that these jealous people are just trying to tear them down and bring them back down, and that they're scared that they're going to succeed and be more successful than them. That is literally, it sounds crazy, but it's what they believe.
Yeah, and another story that kind of blends into what you were saying earlier, Sean, was there's a guy by the name of G. Robert Blakey, who was at the time with the Department of Justice, the DOJ, and he was approached by Procter & Gamble, who was suing Amway at the time, for spreading lies about Procter & Gamble's symbol with the moon and stars being a sign of Satan. And they hired this guy by the name of G. Robert Blakey to look into Amway and give his opinion. Well, he happens to be the guy that actually was, to my understanding, the main author of the RICO statute that was written for the mafia. Now, it's been used for all kinds of other things since then, but it was originally designed to go after the mafia. And he looked at the whole thing. You know, we were talking about families and operations and everything. He said, this looks just like the mafia. And Amway tried to, this is probably in the late 90s, right at the beginning of the internet, you know, the public internet. And Amway tried very hard to get that paper taken down, and they were successful in almost every instance except one. There was a professor, Dave Tereski or something like that. I might be mispronouncing his name, but he basically gave Amway the middle finger. He says, no, I know my constitutional rights. You know, I received this. If the person that gave it to me broke the law, go after them. But you can't come after me because I have the information and I received it. I did not disclose it, even if it was not supposed to be disclosed out of court. You know, too bad. It's a leak. That stuff happens. So now you can find that if you Google, G. Robert Blakey, Amway, Mafia, you can actually see his paper where he says, this reminds me of the mafia. But Amway is definitely, at least back in those days, the late 90s, mid to late 90s, they were very strong in trying to keep things off the internet. And I think they've since learned they can't. They're, you know, to your guys' points, there's just too much information. There's too many people. There's no way they can chase down that number of things now. It's just out of control in a good way. You know, to them it's a bad way, but to me it's in a good way it's out of control. But Glenn, I'll let you add to that.
Yeah, so I'd argue that they have stopped stuff on the internet, because the anti-MLMers, what they look for is new, current people pitching the MLM business on YouTube. And right now, there are no current distributors on YouTube pitching the Amway business. So they've actually achieved the goal of keeping them off YouTube, and therefore they can't be debunked and they can't be analyzed. So I'd say they've done a very, very good job of keeping them off there. And that's the reason why you look at the big anti-MLMs of hundreds of thousands of subscribers. They debunk every single MLM company, the big ones, the small ones, except for Amway, because there's no current distributors on YouTube giving presentations and talking about Amway. It's all done behind closed doors. It's all done in these online trainings, which are locked. People can't get into them. So I would say that Amway's done an amazing job of just keeping it off YouTube and keeping even the so-called anti-MLM experts in the dark. The big anti-MLMers, they've got lots and lots of information about all the other companies, but they've got minimal information on Amway. I really think Amway's done an amazing job of keeping it off YouTube, especially.
You know, if I can make a comment on some of the things that Glenn had mentioned, there are certain parts of what Amway does, as far as Amway doesn't do it, it's these distributors that run these tools business do it. They do a wonderful job of the cult-like nature of the culture. So when people say things like, you're trying to steal my dreams, part of that may be true. Here's the challenge. What they're applying beliefs and these practices to are inherently flawed, meaning you never had a chance at believing what you believe. And unfortunately, with Glenn's dad's situation, it was repeated for 20 years and may even still be repeated. If he had the belief of never quit, exactly, never quit, which maybe you shouldn't quit on your dreams, because if anybody ever quit, if you ever read anybody's success story, it's riddled with people that told them they couldn't do it, and they did it anyway. But the problem is there was never even a possibility for most of the people to be successful in the business model they were trying to apply it to. And that, to me, is so insidious in its nature that it's horrible, because you're stealing people's lives, livelihoods, and their possibility of applying those principles to maybe something else where it would have worked. So that's the problem that I have with a lot of this stuff, because, you could read a book, they're promoting books based on, interesting people. They're promoting books that have sound principles that have been applied by other people in their own businesses, and they become wildly successful. But they won't be applied in Amway unless you're part of that tool scam, and then you can become wildly successful, but you deceived a lot of people in that process, which means that ultimately I think you're a moral failure. Financially, you might be successfully, but morally, you deceived a whole bunch of people. So I feel for your dad, Glenn. When you speak like that, I'm like, you know what? This man sounds, I'm sure your dad's a good man. Like, you've never, ever disparaged your dad apart from his practice of just not giving up Amway. You never said that he beat you when you were a kid. You never said he was an alcoholic. You never said he fooled around on your mom. You never said anything like that about your dad. Your dad's biggest flaw that you've ever exposed with us has been his unrelenting devotion towards a failed business model. And that's a shame. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that live like that. Scott, I know, you lived that failed business model for a really long time until you found out that it was a tool scam. And I think that's the most insidious part of this whole conversation. They steal people's lives. And in this instance, we agree with Robert Fitzpatrick. At least I do. In this instance, not with everything he says, but in this instance, anybody that's anti-MLM for these reasons is the same reason why I'm anti-MLM for these reasons. So back to you, for Glenn, if you want to comment, because I threw out some things related to you, maybe even personally. So can you comment on anything that I relate back to you relative to your dad?
Yeah, I just think it's a tragedy. Like, my dad he was a bank manager he was in the bank for 27 years. So he was very successful in the bank. He was actually very successful in athletics. I don't know if you've seen the movie On Becoming a God in Florida. No. But it had Kirsten Dunst in it. It was like a TV series. Have any of you guys seen that?
I have heard of it. I haven't had a chance to see it yet.
What is it
I
again?
saw the series. It started right before COVID, and they were going to do another season or 2 more seasons, and they never did. But I think it's still out there on, if you look on, different video platforms, streaming services, you might be able to find it somewhere. But it's something to the effect, like Glenn said, on becoming a god in Florida. And I actually talked to a woman a few years ago who claims that she was involved in the production of that series, and she said it was originally using the Amway name, and they were going to really be very specific about Amway. And then one of the film lawyers got a hold of it, and he said, we really can't do that. That's inviting a lawsuit. And so they made it generic. But it's obvious. If you've seen the series, it's obvious that it's Amway, because every caricature that they do, and it's a little bit of comedy thrown in too, but it's not far off as far as reality. And I do recommend people watch that, because it's entertaining and it's informative at the same time. It's kind of like John Oliver's MLM video. He does a really good job of entertaining, and he throws in a lot of good facts. Now, he doesn't talk about the tool scam. That's, something that most people don't even know about or don't understand the significance of it, particularly in Amway. But yeah, that's a good series, Glenn. Have you seen the whole thing, Glenn?
Yeah. I've seen it from start to finish. Yeah, but it's like my dad is that guy. Like, people have said it, like, oh my God, your dad. They made a movie about your dad. People have said that to me. Like, my family members have said, God, they've made a movie about your dad. That's how he was, that guy. Except the problem is he's been that guy for 22 years. But the thing that
that guy didn't last that long. I won't spoil it, but he didn't last that long.
Yeah.
So.
But that guy.
We talked over each other. I apologize. There might be some people that are trying to get the title of that series again. So say it slow. So what is it again?
I'm going to look it up right now and get it exactly for you.
Okay.
Just give me a second and I'll get it for you exactly. It's got Kirsten Dunst. It was on.
Kirsten Dunst. She was in the Spider-Man movies. I mean, she's a A-list type actress. On Becoming a God in Florida, go and look up the exact wording.
On Becoming a God in Central Florida in 2019.
In Central Florida, yes. Yep. Yeah, 2019. So it was right before COVID, and then the whole project kind of fell apart after the first season. Unfortunately, I think if it had gone on for another year or 2 or 3, it really would have had a much bigger impact on the MLM industry. But COVID. So there you go. I guess we're coming near the end of our time here, guys.
That was fast. Holy crap. We have to have you guys come back.
Time flies. We're having fun. So I just wanted, Sean, if you could just, give a couple of minutes of closing, if there's anything that, you wanted to mention during this show that you didn't, or something you thought about during the show that, as all of us were fighting for airtime, you couldn't quite get it in edgewise, go right ahead.
I don't really have anything more. I do hope that people will check out my video. It is very in-depth. It's long. It's an hour, 42 minutes. And it's called The Tools Cult History of the Amway Motivational Tape Scam. And it does focus on a historical story. So I think toward the end here, we talked about what the anti-MLM people have been focusing on, and they do tend to focus on stuff that's happening in the here and now. So to the extent they talk about Amway, they do talk about it a little bit, but not very much. But you'll hear things like Project 20, or is it Project 21? Fred Hartheis's organization.
Network 21. There's a number of them.
21, yes.
But I have to tell you, Sean, even though you have more of a historical perspective and the time frame that you looked at, we've had guests on this show that have just gotten out of Amway, and it's virtually identical to the situation back in the 60s and 70s. So, yes, it's historical, but yes, it's also applicable. So I just want people to understand that you're not looking at ancient history that has changed. You know, we're not talking about the United States pre-slavery here. This is pretty much the same way. So it's
and that was ultimately the point I was going to cycle around to you. Thank you for making it more succinctly than I was going to. But yeah, it hasn't changed a lot in 40 years, and that in itself is highly problematic. That this thing has remained frozen in time for the last 4 decades, and it's bizarre that it can remain sort of untouched to the degree that it has. So I think it is an important story, and I hope that people will seek it out. And I think that historians also need to be. I mean, we've talked about anti-MLM people kind of dropping the ball on some of this stuff, but historians have not been interested in this story either. I'm the first to really tell it in this way. There have been some historical studies done of the Amway phenomenon. I cite some of those in my video. Most of the good work has been done by graduate students in their theses and that kind of thing, but they tend to look at Amway in the context of is it the continuation of the old Yankee peddlers of the 19th century and then the salesman culture of the 1950s and 60s, and what's its relationship to that? So the tools cult, again, doesn't really front and center in the minds of historians, and I think it needs to more, because Dexter Yeager is a hugely important figure in American history. There will be a biography written about him someday. I don't know if I have the patience to take on that project, but
I really urge you to. I'd love to see you write a book. I mean, I've got no doubt that you could write a book better than Fitzpatrick has, and there's never been a person more deserving of a book written about them than Dexter Yeager, and just the history of the Amway Corporation. I can't think of another historical figure that's more under the radar right now than what Dexter Yeager is. So yeah, I urge you to do it. And I really feel like a lot of people would want to read that and would buy that book.
Yeah. Now that he's not only under the radar, but he's not only under the radar now, he's underground, so he's not going to sue you.
He's pushing up daisies. It's true.
And where will we find this? I know you mentioned the title, but where will we find it?
Oh, my video?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. You could search for the Tools Cult, and it should pop right up.
Got it.
I'll tell you what though, that's your first ever video on MLMs. I'm somebody who literally most days I'll type in anti-MLM into YouTube, and that for me wasn't coming up. It wasn't until I put in a very specific Amway tools that it came up. So there's lots of people that are literally who watch lots and lots and lots of anti-MLM content who aren't getting that recommended to them. So the fact that you've had, I think it's about 2,000 or 3,000 people have seen, that's a very, very good result for the lack of recommendation that the videos is getting. So yeah, I really feel like I've got no doubt the analytics for that video are outstanding. If you look at what's the average watch time, like to dislike ratios, if that video was on a big anti-MLM channel, that would explode. But the problem is it's on a channel that isn't an anti-MLM channel. So
right, yeah, and I do a lot of historical stuff. So this is my only MLM related video on my channel.
Yep. And certainly you could add the tag anti-MLM in the video, in the description. That might give you a little more visibility. Yeah. Okay.
Well, the title.
I guess we need to wrap up. Glenn, did you have any other parting comments for everybody?
Watch this documentary from Sean. Honestly, it is the best documentary or video, whatever you want to call it, on MLM. If you want to know the story of the Amway Corporation, this is where you're going to find it. You could look up Amway on YouTube until the cows come home. You could watch the big anti-MLMers, and the stuff that he's telling you, they're not going to tell you about. They don't know about it. So this really, if you want to know about the history of, if you want to know where the money in Amway comes from, this is where it is. This is where to find out about it. I also urge Sean, at the risk of being annoying, please write a book about it. Please work on it, because I'm telling you, if you write a book about it, it will be significantly superior to what else is out there on the marketplace. So I'm probably going to be annoying, but please write a book on Dexter Yeager, the history of Amway, because there's a public out there that's thirsty for this sort of information. Because this industry has, I don't think people understand how much damage it's done to people like my father. He's done this business day in, day out, 6-7 days a week for 2 decades. In the taxi, he'd get up at 5 a.m, he'd get home at 6 o'clock, 6:30, and he would get in the shower so fast, get in the suit, go to a meeting, and get home at midnight. And he would do that over and over again for years and years and years on end. On becoming a guide in Florida, some people are like, oh, that's dramatized, that's over the top. Nobody's that obsessed. My dad is and was. With the bit where he fell asleep in the car because he was so tired listening to the tape, that was my dad. He'd be on the road, as I said, from 5 a.m, get home at 6:30. 16, just crazy amounts of hours. He used to drive home from showing the plan or going to a meeting after a 12-hour workday. That's the sort of damage it's doing to people. It ruined his relation. He's had that many girlfriends, and honestly, the reason why they break up is because he gets them into Amway, and then they figure out it's a scam, and then he tries, and then that's the end of the relationship because he's being told, you got to stay away from people who are negative. You got to stay away from dream stealers. Your partner's a dream stealer, so that ruins that relationship. When my sister decided to go to university, Dad told her, what do you want to go to university for? I know a girl who's younger than you. She's earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from Amway. She's only been in for a few weeks. She's working part-time. The damage it does to a person's relationships, their mental state, I don't think many people understand it. It's so damaging. Anyone who can...
It's huge. Well, I guess we really need to wrap up here. Peter, I'll let you wrap this up and close this out. I just really appreciate both Sean and Glenn being here. This time has gone so fast, and just appreciate you guys coming back together on the show. Go ahead, Peter.
Great information. So I found it for those people who want to look for it. If you use Sean's name, too, it's Sean Munger, so S-E-A-N, and then Munger, M-U-N-G-E-R, and then type in the Tools Cult. You'll be able to find it up on YouTube. And I remember I listened to it. I get a lot of people that throw videos out in my general direction. You got to listen to this guy and whatever. And I'm like, what am I going to learn from this video, about the Amway tool scam? And because we talk about it all the time with Scott Johnson on the radio show, and what a great, wonderful research. Just stuff that no one really knows anything about, put so well together. So, like Glenn, I'll suggest that you do whatever you want to do, but this is a great story, and we'll help you promote it as well. We'll put it on different websites that we have, and I'll put it in the show notes over here as well. So we'll make sure that more people know about it, because it really is great information. So, Glenn, thanks for being here from Australia as usual. Sean, thanks for being here. Scott, thanks for being here as well. And I hope you guys come back. So there's certainly more to talk about. We'll see everybody next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Building Fortunes Radio on buildingfortunesradio.com. Thanks for listening. Be sure to check us out every Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for the designated Building Fortunes Radio segment with Peter Mingles. Be sure to check out the buildingfortunesradio.com website for our featured segments. It's been our privilege to have you listen in. At Building Fortunes Radio, we wish you the success you deserve and are willing to work for. So spread the word, tell a friend, join our newsletter, and go make a difference in your world.